Our world can be a very strange and inexplicable place at times, since every year, people from all over the world report events that they're unable to explain. Added to this is the fact that thousands of crimes have been committed that remain unresolved due to a lack of evidence, and only time will tell if they'll ever be brought to a close. Number 10. Many people think that sightings of strange lights and objects in the sky are a modern phenomenon, but the truth is that these types of sightings have occurred around the globe for centuries. This is evidenced by an event that took place in Robozero, Russia, which is today known as Vologda, in 1663. To add even more mystery to the case, it took place during the day in full view of many people who were left baffled by what they witnessed. Those who were present on the 15th of August that year stated that they became aware of a strange object approaching Robozero from the north at around 10 a.m., and they were immediately intrigued as to what it could be. As it drew closer, they realized it was some kind of sphere that measured around 130 feet in diameter. While this would already have been disconcerting at the time, some of the sphere's other features turned their fascination into sheer horror. The front of the sphere seemed to emit what was described as a beam of flames that stretched about 140 feet ahead of the object, and from its side, it produced an eerie blue smoke trail. In the minutes that followed, it only came closer to the astonished crowd, and they became aware that the entire sphere was a large fireball, which should have been impossible. When it reached an area over a nearby lake, it started to hover in place, and a crowd rushed to the scene out of curiosity. One group was already at the lakeside as they'd gathered there for their parish's Thanksgiving Mass ceremony, and just as they started singing hymns, they became aware of a massive noise that was then determined to be coming from the sphere. They became terrified and ran into the church to pray. The witnesses who remained on the lakeshore stated that the object then suddenly vanished as if into thin air, but before long it rematerialized without explanation. This happened twice more, and each time the sphere would move to the west. Furthermore, each time that it reappeared, the flames that it was engulfed by seemed brighter than before, despite it being the middle of the day. A group of fishermen would later report that they were out on the lake when the object arrived, and that they were forced to retreat to the shore thanks to the intense heat emanating from it. Some suggest that what the townspeople really saw that day were fragments from a meteorite that had broken up in the Earth's atmosphere. But most experts have dismissed this theory, since the sphere was reported to have hovered over the lake for close to 2 hours. Number 9. In 1725, 66-year-old Jean Millet was the owner of an inn in France, and he lived on the property with his 63-year-old wife, Jeanne Lemaire. The couple had been married a long time, and Jean was well known and respected in the area, but he was also known to have a fondness for younger women. This is likely why he was briefly considered a suspect in the demise of his wife, who was unflatteringly described as being overweight, past her prime, and a hopeless alcoholic. Jean had also started showing an interest in one particular servant girl called Lorraine, who worked for a family in town. One night, Jean came downstairs from the couple's bedroom, and when he walked into the kitchen where Jeanne was busy working, he was horrified by what he discovered. Instead of finding his wife cooking as he had expected, he was struck by the realization that she was no longer alive. But while this was shocking to say the least, the manner of her passing is what left him shaken. All that remained of Jeanne was a section of her skull, one arm, her legs, and a few of her vertebrae. The rest of his wife was just a pile of ash, which suggested to him that she'd somehow unintentionally set fire to herself, either when her dress made contact with the fire she was cooking on, or by some other unknown means. The police could find no plausible explanation, and understandably, they pointed the finger at Jean. They knew that he'd become interested in Lorraine, and they accused him of ending Jeanne's life so that they could be together. He was arrested, and these points were presented at his trial. All the while, Jean professed his innocence, stating that he found his wife deceased when he walked into the kitchen that night, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. The court decided he was guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He'd likely have never seen the light of day were it not for one of his lodgers, Nicolas Lecat, who happened to be a surgeon. He contacted the authorities to report that Juan was an alcoholic and that this may have contributed to her demise. He speculated she had enough alcohol in her system to cause spontaneous human combustion. Quite remarkably, the court decided to review Juan's case, likely because surgeons were seen as a reliable and trustworthy people back in the day. Juan was ultimately acquitted and he was freed, but the rest of his life was spent in misery, and the death of his wife was never solved. Number 8. By 1922, the members of the St. John's Episcopal Church in Franklin Township, New Jersey, had started to suspect that the church's priest, Edward W. Hall, wasn't as pious as he pretended to be. They'd started to suspect he was having an affair with a member of the church's choir, a woman named Eleanor Mills. He'd been making frequent visits to her house while neglecting others, and the scandal was made all the worse by the fact that both he and Eleanor were married. Rumors had started to spread that they were being unfaithful to their respective spouses, something that could easily have destroyed Edward's career along with his reputation. But soon enough, he found himself in a far more precarious situation. On the 14th of September that year, Eleanor called Edward from a payphone in town after visiting a candy store at around 7 p.m. It just so happened that one of his female servants walked past Edward while they were speaking on the phone, and she would later report what she had overheard. She stated that she heard him saying, "Yes, yes, yes, that's too bad. I was going down to the church a little later. Can't we make arrangements for later? Say about 8:15. After which, he promptly left the house. He stated that he was heading to Eleanor's house to help her with some of her bills, and he was seen by several witnesses as he walked along Easton Avenue about an hour later. They would also report seeing Eleanor walking that same route earlier that night. At around midnight, people in De Russey's Lane heard a woman screaming, along with the sound of a firearm being discharged. 2 days later, a couple walking along a lover's lane in the early morning came across Eleanor and Edward's remains under a crabapple tree on a nearby farm, and they contacted the police. Eleanor, who was dressed in a polka dot dress, was found with her head leaning on Edward's shoulder. Edward's pipe was found lying on the ground a few feet away, along with one of his business cards. When the immediate area was searched, investigators found several love letters that the pair had written to each other, but the crime scene was soon compromised as members of the public gathered to see what had happened. They handled some of the letters, picked up and replaced Edward's business card, and even took pieces of the tree's bark home with them as macabre souvenirs. An autopsy concluded that both victims' lives had been ended with a firearm, and that Edward had been fired at once, while Eleanor had been struck 3 times before also being attacked with a blade. It seemed as though someone had especially been angry at Eleanor, and the case was reported on by several newspapers. Edward's wife and Eleanor's husband both denied that the victims were having an affair. Frances Noel Hall, Edward's wife, was named as a suspect, but since no proof of her guilt was found, she was soon cleared of suspicion. But when the case was featured again in the New York Daily Mirror, another trial was held, and Frances, along with her 2 brothers, Henry and Willie, were charged. Their trial lasted for 3 weeks, and when all was said and done, all 3 suspects were cleared, since no one had witnessed the crime, and no further evidence was found. The case has never been solved, and will likely never learn who ended Edward and Eleanor's lives that night. Number 7. Those who knew 49-year-old Donna Walter Muller describe her as a devout matriarch to her family, who would do anything to help her neighbors and friends. In 2014, she was living on Stevens Street in Lawncrest, Philadelphia, with her son, 22-year-old Richard, and her daughter, Heather Muller, whose age is not mentioned. On the 19th of January, though, the family's lives would forever be changed when Heather arrived home at around 3:13 p.m. She'd been staying over at her boyfriend's house the previous evening and could never have expected what she found inside the family home. Upon entering, they found Donna deceased on the floor in one of the hallways, and she immediately started searching for Richard, who was then found deceased on his bedroom floor. Luckily, Heather had left her daughter in the care of someone else while she visited her boyfriend, so she was not in the house when the attack took place. She immediately called the police, and neighbors would describe hearing her screaming a short while before sirens were heard approaching. They then saw officers rushing into the house and milling around the scene for the next few days. It was determined that both Richard and Donna had been attacked with the firearm, and strangely, the house showed no signs that anyone had forced their way in, suggesting to investigators that the mother and son might have known their attacker and let them into the building willingly. The attacker also hadn't taken anything from the house, which ruled out burglary as a motive. Neighbors would report hearing some kind of disturbance from the house on the night of the attack, in the form of several loud banging sounds. Another neighbor was certain that the banging sounds were from a firearm that had been discharged twice. Investigators collected a shell casing from a semi-automatic firearm from the scene, and it was hoped that it could be linked to a suspect. Unfortunately, that was not the case. A coroner later determined that the mother and son's lives were ended between 10:30 a.m. and 3 p.m. that day. But since they believed that these were personal and targeted attacks, the family's neighbors were assured their lives were not in danger. Nevertheless, they asked that anyone who saw something suspicious that night come forward so that the culprit could be identified. But no such information was received, despite several people hearing strange noises that day. Donna's family has since made several appeals to the public for information on her mother and brother's case, but to no avail. If you have any information that could help progress this case, you're urged to contact the Philadelphia Police Department's Homicide Unit at 215-686-3334. Number 6. Spring break is supposed to provide students with a chance to relax and have some fun, usually after they've completed their midterms. But for one 18-year-old woman named Susan Jacques, it ends in tragedy. Susan decided to travel to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, from her hometown of Trumbull in Connecticut during the spring break of 1986. And there, she planned on having some fun with her friends, who were among the 10 fellow students who joined her on the trip. They arrived in Fort Lauderdale on the 18th of April that year and booked into the Mark 2100 hotel, planning to stay there for 10 days before heading back home. Susan and her best friend, Kara Buckley, shared a room, and both women were excited to spend some time in Florida while taking some time off of their studies. For the first few days of their trip, everything went to plan, but on the 26th of April, that quickly changed. At around 3:30 a.m., Susan told Kara that she was planning to go for a walk on the beach, which Kara thought was a bad idea. She suggested that Susan take someone with her, since she thought it would be dangerous for a woman to go walking alone at that time of night. But Susan had made up her mind and set out for the beach on her own. Kara and her fellow students believed that Susan wasn't actually headed to the beach, but that she was planning on walking to a nearby nightclub to meet up with a group of people that she'd met earlier that night, and with whom she'd been drinking and dancing before heading back to the hotel for the night. Whatever the case may be, she never returned to the hotel, and the police were informed. During the investigation that followed, a witness would come forward to state that she'd seen Susan talking to a blonde-haired man at about 4 a.m., who at some point asked her whether she was wearing a 1- or 2-piece bathing suit. Searches of the areas around the hotel and the spot where she was last seen were carried out, but no sign of Susan could be found. It wouldn't be until 3 days later that the police made a breakthrough, and Susan's family was informed she was no longer alive. Her remains were found in a canal west of Delray Beach. It was immediately evident that she was a victim of homicide, since her body was placed in a laundry bag before she was left in the canal. And since she'd been in the water for so long, the cause of her passing could not be determined. Susan was identified via her dental records, and it was noted that she had no bruising on her body. Her case was upgraded from a missing person case to a homicide investigation, and robbery was ruled out as a motive, since she was found still wearing all of her jewelry, which was determined to have been quite valuable. The police questioned many women in the area, including known criminals who'd been found guilty of attacking young women in the past, but no suspects could be identified. Anyone who has any information on what happened to Susan that night is asked to contact the Fort Lauderdale Police at 954-828-5700. Number 5. Many theories have been put forward in an effort to explain what happened to 21-year-old Alvin Matlock, who's been missing since the 1st of March, 1951. And most of these theories suggest that he was a victim of foul play. At the time, Alvin who's better known to his friends and family as Bud, had already served in the US military, and according to those who knew him, he was trying to start a life in the Pacific Northwest. In 1951, he decided to spend some time in the wilderness and set off to a cabin in the woods on Brown Mountain outside of Spokane, Washington, where he planned on spending some time away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. He was expected to return home before Thanksgiving so that he could celebrate the holidays with his family. But when he failed to do so, his family became concerned that something untoward might have happened to him while he was out in the wild. They knew he'd planned on staying at that particular cabin, and his mother, unable to cope with the fact that he was missing, decided to travel there to look for him. When she arrived, she was dismayed to find the cabin completely empty. What caused her even greater concern was the fact that his vehicle was no longer parked at the cabin, which meant that he could have traveled in any direction, or that someone had removed it after harming him. For a while, it was speculated that he'd packed up his belongings before traveling to Alaska. But as time went by, his family became convinced that this was not the case. Rumors then started to swirl that Alvin had been having an affair with a married woman, and that her husband had found out about it. Many people feel that the unknown woman's husband decided to end Alvin's life, but this has never been proven. The cabin and its surrounding areas were searched by the police, who could find no evidence of a struggle or of any of Alvin's belongings. If you have any information on Alvin's disappearance, you're asked to contact the Spokane County Sheriff's Office. Number 4. The case involving the murder of 69-year-old Arthur Rochford Manby has become so notorious in Taos, New Mexico, that it's known as the Manby Mystery, and the authorities are no closer to solving the case almost a century later. Arthur didn't have the best reputation in the area, as he was known to be a con man who'd swindled many people out of their money and land. He originally hailed from England and had worked as a mine operator on occasion, but with the money he'd made from the mining operations, he'd purchased a mansion. On the 30th of June, 1929, a U.S. Marshal knocked on the mansion's door with the aim of serving Arthur with a notice of a breach of promise lawsuit. When he got no answer, he started pounding on the door, but still got no response. He had no choice but to leave, and 3 days later, he returned with reinforcements. He and several officers decided to force their way into the house when they once again got no answer to their knocks. Once they made their way inside, they started searching the mansion room by room, believing that Alvin was likely hiding to escape the law once again. But they soon found out that this was not the case. When they walked into his bedroom, they were shocked to find Alvin's remains in a cot, and his head was found in another room. It was a grisly sight that left the officers feeling unsettled, and they were curious to hear what the coroner's findings would be. Strangely, it was announced that Alvin had passed away from natural causes, and that one of his dogs had removed his head. But his two brothers refused to believe this, and they had his remains exhumed. When a second autopsy was conducted, it was discovered that he'd been attacked with a large firearm, and that his head had been removed after the fact. Holes made by the firearm were found in his bed's headboard, and towels that were used to clean the crime scene were found to have been freshly laundered. Adding even more mystery to the case was the fact that the entire mansion had been locked when Alvin's life was ended. Not only were the outside doors locked, but all the windows had been fitted with bars, and his room was locked from the inside. At one point, 3 men were named as suspects, and they were all brought in for questioning, but it soon became clear that they were not involved in the case, and no charges were brought against them. Since Arthur originally hailed from England, the British consulate decided to join in on the investigation, since the local district attorney was found to be intentionally dragging his feet in his inquiries, and even the governor at the time was growing impatient with the lack of progress that was being made. The Auditor General stated on several occasions that no proof could be found that Arthur had been attacked, despite the fact that it was certain that his life was ended with a firearm that did not belong to him, and which was never found. The British consulate's investigation eventually also grew cold, as no suspects could be identified, even though many people would have had a motive to want to end Arthur's life. It was suggested that the mansion had been secured in the way that it was found due to Arthur's paranoia that someone was coming after him. Since he'd swindled so many people out of their money and land, this was a very real possibility, but the theory could not be proven. It was also suggested that his attacker knew about the secret passages that led in and out of the mansion, and that he'd managed to make it into the house undetected that way, but no such passages were ever found. Today, we have no idea who ended Arthur's life, how they did it, or why, and his unsolved case remains the oldest in the history of New Mexico. Number 3. Much like Arthur Manby's case, the investigation into an attack on 66-year-old Lewis Allen, which occurred in Westfield, Massachusetts in 1940, is one that is rife with strange and outlandish theories that have never been proven. Lewis was a professor of chemistry at Westfield Teachers College, now known as Westfield State University, but he was also a well-known member of the Pure Foods movement, which sought to bring light to poor food and toxicity safety standards that existed at the time. According to those who knew him, Lewis was a very handsome man who could often be seen spending time in the company of different women, one of whom was rumored to be the chief of the police's mistress. Due to his involvement with the Pure Food movement, many grocers in the area considered Lewis to be a threat, and it's been suggested that his life was ended by someone whose business would have been harmed by stricter food regulations. On the 7th of May that year, he'd returned home after a long day of work and had settled into his favorite armchair with his pipe and a book. His wife Alice decided to go to bed at around 9:30 p.m., but she made sure to mention that she left the front door unlocked and the porch lights on, since Anna, the couple's servant, had gone out and would be back later. She would tell the police that at around 10 p.m., she heard Lewis get up from his chair before walking to the front door, and after he opened it, she heard what she described as horseplay going on. She heard Lewis say something in a hushed voice before 5 shots rang out, and she immediately started to worry that something bad had happened. She rushed downstairs to find Lewis deceased and his attacker gone. She added that the shots that were fired seemed too quiet to be from a firearm, and the police decided that his attacker must have used a silencer. Strangely, some reports stated that his attacker had fired once through one of the porch windows, despite Alice having stated she heard Lewis open the front door before his life was ended. A neighbor would tell the police that she'd seen a black sedan with its lights turned off, parked a short distance away from Lewis's house, shortly before the attack took place, and inside she saw a man with sunglasses and his collar turned up, and he seemed to be waiting for something, either an accomplice or for the right time to strike. But it would later come to light that Lewis had been working on a formula that would replace a sugar substitute in food. A friend of his reported that Lewis had been talking to foreign governments about this formula, and that he'd refused to speak to them the day before the attack. When the case went cold without any suspects being named, a $500 reward was offered for information leading to Lewis's attacker being identified, but no one ever came forward with any leads. The case has been revisited many times in the years that have since passed, but since most of Lewis's case files were destroyed or lost in a flood, it's unlikely the authorities will ever find out who ended his life or what their motive was for doing so. Number 2. In October of 1943, the Second World War was still being fought, and 25-year-old Naomi Cheney was serving as a lieutenant in the Women's Army Corps. She was stationed at Technical School, Army Air Force Training Command in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, after just being transferred there. Naomi originally hailed from Jasper, Alabama, and she graduated from the Florida State College for Women at Tallahassee in 1942. She completed her studies with a major in home economics, after which she taught at a high school for just 1 term. She entered officer school on the 26th of April, 1943, and there she was described by her fellow officers as, quote, very attractive. She was appointed as a commissioned officer on the 5th of June that year, and was then sent to Sioux Falls. On the 5th of October that year, her superiors were informed that Naomi could not be found anywhere, and at first it was suspected that she decided to abscond, and she was accused of having gone AWOL. A guard would report having seen Naomi at around 9 p.m. that night when she returned from the school's hospital, where she'd been visiting a friend. The two spoke briefly when she asked the guard whether it was safe for her to walk home alone, and he told her that she should use her own judgment. He speculated that she chose to walk along a shortcut that led her past a set of railroad tracks, but this remains just a theory. The next day, Naomi's remains were found by a member of the public in a ravine about 40 feet from the tracks. a trail of biological material was tracked to a nearby cabin, and inside they found a 31-year-old farm laborer whose shoes were covered in biological material. He was arrested, but no proof could be found that he had ended Naomi's life, and he was set free after 3 weeks, despite the fact that the cabin was also covered in biological material. In the ravine, they found her handkerchief, which also contained biological material, as well as her hat, a flight hat, and her purse, none of which provided investigators with any useful clues as to who had ended her life. Even the doctors who examined her body couldn't agree as to how she lost her life, since one believed she'd been assaulted, while the other thought she'd been run over with a car. Either way, it was certain that she'd been attacked, and a suspect had to be identified. But when the case started to grow cold, investigators went as far as to travel to Arkansas, Georgia, and Tennessee, where they sought the aid of fortune tellers, who unsurprisingly weren't of much help. What further hampered the investigation was the fact that the officers who responded to Naomi's remains being found had trampled all over the crime scene, and a lot of evidence was destroyed, leaving the case unsolved. Number 1. The neighbors of 82-year-old Nick and 74-year-old Jane Getrin, a retired couple who'd moved to Clearwater in Florida from Wisconsin, described them as lovely people who were well liked in their neighborhood and who are still remembered by the residents of the Jackson Road area today. Nick originally hailed from Greece, but after immigrating to the U.S., he settled in Menominee, Wisconsin, where he was a successful businessman. He owned the Olympia Confectionery Store, the Broadway Cafe, and the Hotel Marion in that area, and had secured his and Jane's future before their retirement. In December of 1968, the couple was getting ready to celebrate Christmas, and they could have never expected that they were about to become the subjects of a homicide investigation that remains unsolved more than 50 years later. On Christmas Eve that year, one of their neighbors decided to stop off at the Getrins' home to drop off some Christmas presents, but when she knocked on the door, she was surprised to get no answer. She decided to look through a window to see if everything was all right, but she then made a gruesome discovery. She spotted the couple lying on the ground, dressed in their pajamas, unresponsive. The neighbor alerted the police, who found Jane deceased on the floor, while Nick was discovered to still be alive but in bad condition. They determined that someone had broken into the house at some point during the evening, after which they assaulted the couple to the point where Jane lost her life. Nick was rushed to a nearby hospital, where doctors did everything they could to save his life, but 3 days later, he also passed away. When the house was searched, it was discovered that several expensive items were missing, and the authorities stated that a burglar had been surprised by the couple upon entering the building, and rather than flee, he decided to attack them. Thanks to the state of the house, which was found to be in disarray, it was speculated that either Nick or Jane had entered a room while the burglar was stealing their property, and that a violent struggle then broke out. While being treated in the hospital, Nick managed to regain consciousness for a short while, and investigators tried to talk to him in an effort to find out who'd carried out the attack that night. But he'd sustained serious head injuries during the struggle, and was unable to form coherent sentences. But he did, according to some sources, manage to disclose something before losing consciousness again, and it's believed he alluded to the attacker's identity, but his last words have never been disclosed to the public. It would later be revealed that a similar robbery had been carried out at another elderly couple's house that night. The house was just a few streets away from Nick and Jane's house, but it was never confirmed whether the two cases were related, since the couple at that house slept through the burglary. To this day, the case remains unsolved. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.